On the morning of March 3, 1943, at precisely 10:17 a.m., a 47-year-old man named Paul Irving Gunn stood at the flight line in Port Moresby, New Guinea, observing a formation of 12 B-25 Mitchell bombers preparing for takeoff. The aircraft were taxiing toward their target, a Japanese convoy consisting of 8 troop transport ships carrying 6,900 soldiers. The tropical air vibrated with the roar of engines as propellers churned through the humid atmosphere, and pilots signaled their readiness from their cockpits. Gunn had dedicated the entire previous night to personally inspecting every gun installation on these aircraft. Each bomber had been equipped with 14 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, creating a combined arsenal of 168 guns across the entire strike force. These weapon systems were unauthorized modifications that should not have existed according to any official military documentation. Gunn's background made his role particularly unusual. He was a former Navy mechanic who had become a civilian bush pilot, possessing zero official authority to modify military aircraft. His modifications had been constructed in salvage yards, using basic tools like hacksaws, driven by an intense determination that bordered on obsession. He had violated every regulation contained in the Army Air Force Maintenance Manual. Yet, in approximately 18 minutes, his unauthorized modifications would result in the deaths of more Japanese soldiers than any other single air attack in Pacific War history. The strategic situation. The Japanese military had dispatched a reinforcement convoy from Rabaul to Lae, consisting of 8 transport vessels loaded with infantry and 8 destroyers providing protection. The total troop strength amounted to 6,900 soldiers. The successful landing of these forces in New Guinea would have given the Japanese sufficient strength to overwhelm Allied positions in the region. The 5th Air Force had received orders to prevent this landing at all costs. High-altitude bombing attempts had already been executed. B-17s and B-24s had conducted attacks on the previous day, managing to score several hits that slowed the convoy's progress. However, the transport ships remained seaworthy, the troops remained alive, and the invasion force continued its advance toward New Guinea. The fundamental problem with American bombing tactics. For 18 months, United States bomber crews had attempted to sink Japanese ships using high-altitude level bombing techniques. The standard procedure involved approaching from altitudes of 10,000 feet, carefully calculating trajectories, and releasing bombs while hoping for successful hits. The results were consistently disappointing because ships were mobile targets operating in vast ocean spaces. The physics of the situation were unforgiving. Gravity followed predictable patterns, but moving targets did not. Statistical analysis revealed that out of every 100 bombs dropped on moving ships, approximately 3 achieved hits. This represented a 3% accuracy rate, meaning that 97% of bombs created nothing more than expensive splashes in the ocean while accomplishing no military objectives. Meanwhile, Japanese convoys continued their operations, reinforcing their positions and maintaining their strategic advantages. General George Kenney, who commanded the 5th Air Force, had reviewed countless reports describing American bombers expending thousands of tons of ordnance while hitting nothing but seawater. The reports consistently mentioned near misses, technical difficulties, and unfavorable weather conditions. The underlying reality was straightforward. American bombers lacked the capability to hit moving ships with any reliability, and Japanese commanders understood this weakness. The Navy possessed the capability to sink ships effectively, submarines achieved good results, and dive bombers operating from aircraft carriers occasionally scored hits. However, in the Southwest Pacific Theater, the Navy lacked sufficient assets to address the problem. Most carriers were committed to operations in the Central Pacific. The Southwest Pacific remained the Air Force's area of responsibility, and the Air Force was failing to meet its objectives. General Kenny required a solution that did not depend on hitting moving targets from 2 miles above the ocean. He found that solution in a 47-year-old mechanic who had been systematically breaking regulations since December 1941. Paul Irving Gunn's background and personal tragedy. Paul Irving Gunn should not have been involved in the war effort under normal circumstances. He had served in the Navy during World War I, where he acquired expertise in aviation maintenance. After leaving the service in 1919, he relocated to the Philippines and established himself as a civilian bush pilot. By 1941, he was flying cargo routes throughout the Pacific Islands, earning substantial income and raising his family in Manila. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed everything. When Japanese forces invaded the Philippines, Gunn attempted to evacuate his wife and 4 children. He managed to get them to the port at Manila and secured their passage on a ship departing for Australia on December 26, 1941. Gunn remained behind in the Philippines, reasoning that someone needed to fly intelligence officers out of Manila before the Japanese arrived, evacuate wounded soldiers, and maintain aircraft operations when spare parts were non-existent and maintenance facilities were under bombardment. Gunn rejoined the military in January 1942. The Army Air Force desperately needed every qualified pilot and mechanic available. Given his skills in both flying and repairing virtually any aircraft, they assigned him the position of civilian technical advisor. This designation meant he held no official rank, possessed no formal authority, and occupied no position in the chain of command. Paradoxically, this meant no superior officer could prevent him from taking any action he deemed necessary. The ship carrying Gunn's family never reached Australia. Japanese submarines intercepted it off the coast of Mindanao, torpedoed the vessel, and killed everyone on board. The Red Cross confirmed these deaths in March 1942. Gunn received the telegram while working on a P-40 fighter aircraft at an airfield outside Darwin. He read the message twice, folded it carefully, placed it in his pocket, and returned to his work. A colleague inquired whether he was managing adequately under the circumstances. Gunn's response was matter of fact. The Japanese had taken everything he cared about, and now he intended to take everything from them. This was not poetic language or metaphorical expression. From that moment forward, every aircraft Gunn touched became a weapon specifically designed to kill as many Japanese personnel as possible in the most efficient manner imaginable. The failure of high-altitude bombing. The initial failures of Pacific bomber operations became apparent in August 1942. A B-17 Flying Fortress was conducting operations over Bougainville when the crew spotted a Japanese cruiser, which appeared to be an ideal target. The crew climbed to bombing altitude of 12,000 feet. The bombardier performed calculations accounting for wind speed, ship velocity, and trajectory while releasing 8 500-pound bombs. All 8 bombs missed their target. The cruiser executed a turn, and the bombs fell into empty ocean. The crew returned to base in a state of frustration and filed their report. The cruiser remained undamaged, and the mission was classified as a failure. This pattern repeated itself continuously. Different crews engaged different ships with identical results, bombs consistently missing their targets. The underlying issue was rooted in physics. A ship traveling at 20 knots covers approximately 34 feet per second. Bombs dropped from 10,000 feet require approximately 24 seconds to reach the ocean's surface. During those 24 seconds, a ship travels roughly 816 feet. Unless the bombardier calculated the exact speed, exact course, and exact moment for bomb release with perfect precision, the bombs would impact where the ship had been, rather than where it currently was. German U-boat commanders had identified this weakness early in the war. They learned to observe incoming bombers and execute hard turns at the moment bombs were released. The bombs would consistently miss by hundreds of yards. Japanese ship captains employed identical tactics. Upon spotting American bombers at altitude, they would wait and observe. The instant they detected bombs falling, they would initiate emergency evasive maneuvers, causing American bombs to hit nothing but water. By September 1942, the 5th Air Force had documented a 3% hit rate against moving ships, representing 3 hits per 100 bombs dropped. This performance level was completely unacceptable. Some bomber crews experimented with lower altitude approaches, attempting attacks from 5,000 feet and then 3,000 feet. Lower altitudes reduced the time available for ships to maneuver, but simultaneously exposed the aircraft to more accurate anti-aircraft fire. Japanese ships carried substantial anti-aircraft armament. 2 B-17s were shot down during low-altitude bombing attempts in September. 3 additional aircraft sustained damage so severe they never returned to service. Lower altitude attacks proved ineffective, and maintaining high altitude approaches also failed to produce results. No conventional approach was working. General Kenny reviewed the reports and consulted with his bomber crews. They universally provided the same assessment. Hitting moving ships with level bombing was not feasible unless the ship was stationary or they experienced extraordinary luck. Kenny asked his staff for alternative approaches. One suggestion involved bringing bombers in at even lower altitudes, perhaps dropping from 500 feet instead of 10,000 feet. His staff identified several problems with this concept. Bombs required a minimum falling distance to arm their fusing mechanisms. Releasing from excessively low altitudes would result in bombs striking targets without detonating. Additionally, flying at 500 feet placed aircraft well within range of every defensive weapon on Japanese ships, including machine guns and anti-aircraft cannons. Aircraft would likely be destroyed before reaching their targets. One of Kenny's officers mentioned an unconventional technique the Australians had experimented with: skip bombing. The concept involved flying at extremely low altitude over the water, approximately 200 feet, and releasing bombs so they would skip across the water's surface like a stone and impact the ship's hull below the waterline. The concept had theoretical merit. British pilots had successfully sunk a German ship using skip bombing in 1940. However, the technique required perfect timing, perfect altitude control, and perfect speed while flying directly toward a ship that was targeting the aircraft with every available weapon. Kenny considered the concept carefully and inquired whether anyone had tested skip bombing in the Pacific theater. No one had attempted it. The idea appeared to be essentially suicidal. Kenny issued a message to all bomber squadrons requesting volunteers for experimental low-altitude attack training at Port Moresby. 8 pilots volunteered. All of them had experienced failure in hitting ships with high-altitude bombing. All of them wanted to attempt something different, even if it meant flying 200 feet above the ocean while Japanese gunners attempted to kill them. One of these volunteers was Captain Ed Larner, a 28-year-old pilot from Texas. He had flown 12 missions against Japanese ships with 0 successful hits. His level of frustration motivated him to try any alternative approach. Gunn's revolutionary modification concept. Gunn was present at Port Moresby when Larner's training exercises commenced. He observed the B-25 bombers practicing skip bombing runs against target barrels floating in the ocean. The pilots were developing reasonable proficiency, achieving hits on the barrels approximately 40% of the time. This represented significant improvement over the 3% rate, but still fell short of adequate performance. A critical problem remained. Barrels did not return fire. Gunn watched Lerner's bomber approach at low altitude over the water, release a practice bomb, skip it successfully into the barrel, and then pull up and fly away. Gunn recognized that the bomber was completely vulnerable during the attack run. Flying straight and level at 200 feet created a perfect target for anti-aircraft guns.
The B-25 was equipped with nose guns consisting of a single .50 caliber machine gun in the plexiglass nose section. The bombardier operated this weapon. However, one gun provided insufficient firepower to suppress anti-aircraft fire from a ship carrying dozens of defensive weapons. Gunn approached Larner after he landed and inquired whether he believed one nose gun provided adequate firepower. Larner responded negatively, explaining that flying directly at a ship equipped with numerous anti-aircraft guns while possessing only one machine gun for suppressive fire was essentially suicidal. However, he questioned what alternatives existed. Gunn proposed equipping the aircraft with additional guns. When Larner asked how many additional guns, Gunn responded that he was considering all of them. Gunn's concept was straightforward. The B-25 had multiple guns distributed throughout the aircraft, one in the nose, two in the turret, two in the waist positions, and one in the tail, totaling 7 guns pointing in various directions. Gunn envisioned modifying the configuration so all guns pointed forward. His plan involved removing the glass nose section and mounting 8 .50 caliber machine guns pointing straight ahead, with 4 guns on each side. Combined with the 2 guns from the turret, this would create 10 forward-firing guns. 10 guns would generate 700 rounds per second of sustained fire. 10 guns would deliver such concentrated firepower on a ship that anti-aircraft crews would seek cover rather than maintain their firing positions. If the anti-aircraft guns were not firing, the bomber could survive the attack run close to effective range and skip the bomb into the ship's hull. Larner inquired whether Gunn could actually accomplish such a modification, specifically mounting 8 guns in the nose section. Gunn responded that it was probably feasible if no one prevented him from attempting it. Larner asked who would stop him. Gunn explained that anyone with authority could halt the project, which was precisely why he had no intention of requesting permission. The first modification.
German U-boat commanders had identified this weakness early in the war. They learned to observe incoming bombers and execute hard turns at the moment bombs were released. The bombs would consistently miss by hundreds of yards. Japanese ship captains employed identical tactics. Upon spotting American bombers at altitude, they would wait and observe. The instant they detected bombs falling, they would initiate emergency evasive maneuvers, causing American bombs to hit nothing but water. By September 1942, the 5th Air Force had documented a 3% hit rate against moving ships, representing 3 hits per 100 bombs dropped. This performance level was completely unacceptable. Some bomber crews experimented with lower altitude approaches, attempting attacks from 5,000 feet and then 3,000 feet. Lower altitudes reduced the time available for ships to maneuver, but simultaneously exposed the aircraft to more accurate anti-aircraft fire. Japanese ships carried substantial anti-aircraft armament. 2 B-17s were shot down during low-altitude bombing attempts in September. 3 additional aircraft sustained damage so severe they never returned to service. Lower altitude attacks proved ineffective, and maintaining high-altitude approaches also failed to produce results. No conventional approach was working. General Kenny reviewed the reports and consulted with his bomber crews. They universally provided the same assessment. Hitting moving ships with level bombing was not feasible unless the ship was stationary or they experienced extraordinary luck. Kenny asked his staff for alternative approaches. One suggestion involved bringing bombers in at even lower altitudes, perhaps dropping from 500 feet instead of 10,000 feet. His staff identified several problems with this concept. Bombs required a minimum falling distance to arm their fusing mechanisms. Releasing from excessively low altitudes would result in bombs striking targets without detonating. Additionally, flying at 500 feet placed aircraft well within range of every defensive weapon on Japanese ships, including machine guns and anti-aircraft cannons. Aircraft would likely be destroyed before reaching their targets. One of Kenny's officers mentioned an unconventional technique the Australians had experimented with: skip bombing.
The concept involved flying at extremely low altitude over the water, approximately 200 feet, and releasing bombs so they would skip across the water surface like a stone and impact the ship's hull below the waterline. The concept had theoretical merit. British pilots had successfully sunk a German ship using skip bombing in 1940. However, the technique required perfect timing, perfect altitude control, and perfect speed, all while flying directly toward a ship that was targeting the aircraft with every available weapon. Kenny considered the concept carefully and inquired whether anyone had tested skip bombing in the Pacific theater. No one had attempted it. The idea appeared to be essentially suicidal. Kenny issued a message to all bomber squadrons requesting volunteers for experimental low-altitude attack training at Port Moresby. 8 pilots volunteered. All of them had experienced failure in hitting ships with high-altitude bombing. All of them wanted to attempt something different, even if it meant flying 200 feet above the ocean while Japanese gunners attempted to kill them. One of these volunteers was Captain Ed Larner, a 28-year-old pilot from Texas. He had flown 12 missions against Japanese ships with 0 successful hits. His level of frustration motivated him to try any alternative approach.
He obtained a wrecked B-25 from the salvage yard, an aircraft that had ground looped during landing. The fuselage was bent and the engines were damaged, but the nose section remained intact. Gunn removed the plexiglass using a hacksaw, a process that required 4 hours of continuous work. The plexiglass material was thick and the sawing caused blisters on his hands. He did not stop working. Once the plexiglass was removed, he had created an empty nose cavity, a large opening where the bombardier had previously been positioned. He salvaged 4.50 caliber machine guns from damaged fighters. Each gun weighed 84 pounds. He mounted these guns in the nose cavity, positioning 2 on each side and angling them slightly downward. He then salvaged the ammunition feed systems from the same damaged fighters and configured them to supply the nose guns from ammunition boxes located in the fuselage. The entire modification process required 3 days. He worked alone, primarily during nighttime hours, because if engineering officers discovered he was modifying bombers without authorization, they would immediately shut down his operation. On the 4th day, he demonstrated the modification to Larner. Larner climbed into the modified B-25 and examined the 4 machine guns pointing forward. He inquired whether Gunn had test-fired the weapons. Gunn responded negatively, explaining that he wished to avoid attracting attention. Larner stated he would test them in actual combat. General Kenny learned about the modification from one of his intelligence officers. The officer reported that a civilian mechanic had installed unauthorized guns on a B-25. Kenny inquired whether the guns functioned properly. The officer acknowledged that no one knew because the aircraft had not yet been flown. Kenny authorized the test flight, noting that if the modification proved effective, they would address the paperwork requirements later. The first combat test. On October 6, 1942, Larner flew the modified B-25 on a skip bombing mission targeting a Japanese destroyer off Bougainville. He approached a 200 feet altitude at full throttle. The destroyer opened fire with its anti-aircraft weapons. Tracer rounds filled the air. Larner activated his 4 nose guns. The B-25 shook from the recoil as 4 machine guns fired simultaneously, generating 280 rounds per second. Tracer rounds reached outward and hammered the destroyer's deck. Japanese gunners scattered and sought cover, ceasing their defensive fire. Larner skipped his bomb into the destroyer's hull. The explosion created a hole below the waterline. The destroyer began listing and started sinking. Larner pulled up, climbed away from the target, and returned to Port Moresby with considerable satisfaction. This represented the first successful skip bombing operation in the Pacific theater. 1 destroyer sunk using 1 modified bomber. Kenny wanted additional modified aircraft immediately. He instructed Gunn to modify 12 more B-25s using the same configuration with 4 nose guns and to complete the work as rapidly as possible. Gunn proposed an enhancement beyond 4 guns. When Kenny asked how many guns he was considering, Gunn stated 14 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. His concept involved removing the bombardier position entirely, eliminating the Norden bomb sight, removing the plexiglass nose section, and mounting 8 guns in the nose with 4 on each side. The 2 guns in the upper turret would be fixed in the forward position, and 4 additional guns would be mounted in blisters on the fuselage sides. 14 guns would generate 980 rounds per second of sustained fire. 14 guns would deliver such overwhelming firepower that Japanese ships would be severely damaged before the bomber even released its ordnance. Kenny authorized the modification. The mass production of the Straffer. Gunn worked continuously for 6 weeks. He salvaged guns from multiple sources: damaged fighters, damaged bombers, and depot storage facilities. He salvaged ammunition feed systems, mounting brackets, and electrical systems. He fabricated components in machine shops using salvaged aluminum. He performed welding work on gun mounts during nighttime hours. He rewired fighter control systems without access to blueprints or technical manuals. Other mechanics provided assistance. Word spread through the maintenance crews about the civilian mechanic who was building bombers specifically designed to kill Japanese personnel with maximum efficiency. No one attempted to stop him. Everyone offered assistance. By December 1942, Gunn had modified 12 B-25s. Each aircraft featured 14 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. The aircraft resembled flying porcupines with guns protruding from multiple locations. General Kenny designated them commerce destroyers. The official designation was B-25 CD Straffer variant. Pilots referred to them as gunships. The modified bombers were extraordinarily intimidating. When all 14 guns fired simultaneously, the recoil reduced the aircraft's speed by 15 miles per hour. The noise level was beyond extreme. The muzzle flash from 14 guns illuminated the entire nose section. The firepower was absolutely devastating. Test firing demonstrated that 14 guns could fire 980 rounds per second. A 3-second burst resulted in 2,940 bullets being fired. Each bullet was a .5 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round, capable of penetrating steel plate. 3 seconds of sustained fire possessed the capability to cut a Japanese destroyer in half. Training for the new tactics. Training commenced in January 1943. Pilots learned to operate the modified B-25s. The additional weight in the nose section made the aircraft nose-heavy, requiring constant trim adjustments. However, once pilots adapted to the handling characteristics, the aircraft performed adequately. The primary training challenge was psychological. Pilots needed to overcome their instinctive response to climb under fire. Skip bombing required flying directly toward the target at 200 feet altitude while anti-aircraft fire attempted to destroy the aircraft. Every instinct demanded climbing, turning, and evading. However, climbing resulted in missed targets. Turning resulted in missed targets. Pilots had to fly directly into concentrated enemy fire without deviation. Gunn provided guidance to pilots, instructing them to focus on their guns rather than enemy guns. When they observed anti-aircraft tracers, they should commence firing and not cease firing until they had passed the target. Their objective was to eliminate enemy gunners before enemy gunners could eliminate them. The approach was simple, brutal, and effective. By February 1943, the 5th Air Force had 16 modified B-25 Straffers prepared for combat operations. They were about to engage the largest Japanese convoy of the war. The Japanese convoy.
Japanese intelligence had assessed Allied strength in New Guinea and concluded that American and Australian forces were weak, undermanned, undersupplied, and vulnerable. If Japan could reinforce their garrison at Lae with 6,900 fresh troops, they could initiate an offensive that would push Allied forces back to Port Moresby or potentially farther. Japanese command assembled 8 transport ships and loaded them with soldiers, ammunition, and supplies. They added 8 destroyers for protection. The convoy would sail from Rabaul to Lae, covering 600 miles over approximately 3 days. Allied intelligence detected the convoy on March 1st. Codebreakers intercepted Japanese radio communications. The convoy was underway, carrying 6,900 troops. If these forces successfully landed, Allied positions would be critically compromised. General Kenny convened an emergency planning session. Every available bomber would attack the convoy: B-17s, B-24s, B-25s, and A-20s. All aircraft would participate. High-altitude bombers would conduct initial attacks, attempting to damage or slow the convoy. Subsequently, the Straffers would execute low-altitude attacks to complete the destruction. Guns-modified B-25s would deliver the decisive blow.
The Battle of the Bismarck Sea begins. On March 2, 1943, reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy 200 miles north of Lae. 8 transports and 8 destroyers were sailing in formation. American bombers launched their attacks. B-17s attacked first from 10,000 feet altitude. They dropped dozens of bombs, scored several hits, damaged 1 transport, and slowed the convoy's progress. However, the convoy continued sailing. During the night, the Japanese convoy altered course in an attempt to evade further attacks. Allied reconnaissance aircraft maintained tracking. B-24s attacked on the morning of March 3rd with additional high-altitude bombing. More near misses occurred, and 1 additional transport sustained damage. The convoy was wounded, but remained operational. The transports remained seaworthy, and the troops remained alive. The Strafer Attack. At 10:17 a.m., Gunn's strafers departed from Port Moresby, 12 B-25s flying in 4 flights of 3 aircraft each. Each bomber carried 14 forward-firing machine guns, 4 500-pound bombs, and pilots who had trained for this operation for 2 months. They had practiced skip bombing until they could hit floating targets 90% of the time. They had test-fired the 14-gun configuration until recoil patterns were completely memorized. They understood precisely how much ammunition they carried and exactly how long they could sustain fire before depleting their ammunition. They flew at extremely low altitude over the water, maintaining 50 feet above the waves to remain below Japanese radar coverage. Ocean spray misted their windscreens. They maintained tight formation, flying wingtip to wingtip, because precision mattered significantly. They approached the convoy from the south, using the sun at their backs for tactical advantage. At 10:35 a.m., the strafers reached the convoy. Visibility conditions were perfect, with clear skies and calm seas. The Japanese ships were sailing in 2 columns, with 4 transports and 4 destroyers in each column, spread across a mile of ocean. They presented excellent targets, with no concealment available. Captain Ed Larner led the first wave, consisting of 4 B-25 strafers. They approached at 200 feet altitude at full throttle, traveling at 280 miles per hour. Larner could observe Japanese sailors on deck, anti-aircraft crews manning their weapons, and the rising sun insignia painted on the destroyer's bow. The Japanese destroyers detected the incoming attack. Klaxons sounded throughout the ships. Gun crews rotated their weapons and opened fire. Anti-aircraft tracers arced across the water, creating streams of red and orange reaching toward the incoming bombers. The destroyers employed 25mm cannons, 13mm machine guns, and every available defensive weapon. Larder counted to 3, allowing the tracers to approach closely and permitting Japanese gunners to commit to their firing solutions. Then he activated his trigger. 14 machine guns commenced firing simultaneously. The B-25 shook violently from the recoil. The nose dropped slightly, requiring Larner to pull back on the control stick to maintain altitude. The sound exceeded any normal definition of loud, resembling the noise of a train collision. The entire aircraft vibrated intensely. Tracer rounds extended outward for 1,000 yards, creating 14 streams of .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Each round weighed 1.7 ounces and traveled at 2,900 feet per second. 980 rounds per second departed the aircraft. The destroyer in front of Larner disappeared behind a wall of impacts. Metal sparked and armor plate shredded. Anti-aircraft gun shields disintegrated. The superstructure came apart as if constructed from cardboard. Japanese gunners died at their positions. Some were cut in half by the sustained fire. Others were thrown overboard by the impacts. The survivors sought cover and ceased firing, which was precisely what Larner required. He was 400 yards from the target, 3 seconds from bomb release. His bombardier, positioned behind where the nose guns formerly existed, was counting down. At the designated moment, Larner activated the bomb release mechanism. He felt the aircraft lift slightly as 4 500-pound bombs dropped. The bombs fell in sequence rather than simultaneously. The bombs had delayed fuses and would skip across the water before detonating on contact with the hull. The first bomb skipped 3 times like a stone across a pond, striking the destroyer just below the waterline directly at the engine room location. The explosion penetrated through the hull and water rushed in. The second bomb impacted near the bow, creating a hole 20 feet across. The third and fourth bombs struck amidships. The destroyer buckled and began breaking in half. Larner pulled up sharply, climbing over the dying destroyer. He looked back to observe. The ship was sinking rapidly. 90 seconds had elapsed from first hit to complete sinking. Sailors were abandoning ship by jumping overboard. Most would not survive, as the water was filled with burning fuel oil. The systematic destruction. The other 3 B-25s in the first wave engaged the remaining destroyers. 14 guns per aircraft created a combined total of 56 guns. The collective firepower was catastrophic. The Japanese had never experienced anything comparable, had never trained for such an encounter, and possessed no tactical doctrine to counter it. Within 3 minutes of the initial attack, 3 destroyers were either sinking or dead in the water and incapable of movement. The fourth destroyer attempted to escape, initiating emergency speed, with black smoke pouring from its stacks as the engine room generated maximum power. The attempt came too late. A B-25 piloted by Lieutenant James Murphy approached from the port side, intercepting the destroyer in a crossing attack. 14 guns raked the destroyer's entire length from stern to bow. The fire pattern walked up the ship's length like someone dragging a chainsaw across steel. The destroyer's portside anti-aircraft guns were shredded. Gun crews died. The bridge sustained concentrated hits, killing everyone inside. Murphy skipped his bombs, with one striking the engine room. The destroyer stopped immediately, just ceased all movement as if power had been cut, and began listing immediately. It would sink within 10 minutes. The second wave of strafers arrived at 10:41 a.m., consisting of 8 B-25s. They bypassed the destroyers and proceeded directly to the transports.
The troops were located on the transports, representing the actual strategic target. Transports were slow vessels, lightly armed and packed with soldiers. They essentially functioned as death traps disguised as ships. The B-25s approached in line astern formation, one aircraft following another. Each aircraft fired 14 guns and skipped bombs. No complex maneuvers were employed, just direct approaches with overwhelming firepower creating systematic destruction. The first transport, Kyokusei Maru, displacing 6,900 tons and carrying 1,200 soldiers, received fire from two B-25s simultaneously. The machine gun fire tore through the upper decks. Soldiers had been standing in formation on deck, preparing to disembark when they reached Leh. They were densely packed, creating perfect targets. The iron needlets rounds tore through personnel. Bodies fell and blood sprayed across the deck. Soldiers attempted to flee and find cover. No cover existed. The machine gun fire was omnipresent, sustained, and relentless. A 3-second burst from 14 guns per aircraft, with 2 aircraft engaging, resulted in 5,880 rounds hitting the transport in 6 seconds. Subsequently, the bombs struck. 4 500-pound bombs from the first B-25 and 4 more from the second created a total of 8 bombs. They punched into the hull below the waterline. The explosions tore the ship open. Fuel tanks ruptured, fires ignited, and water rushed in. The transport began sinking immediately. Soldiers on deck jumped into the ocean, preferring drowning to burning. Others were trapped below deck when the ship rolled. They were confined in troop compartments and could not escape. The ship went down in 8 minutes. Most of the 1,200 soldiers went down with the vessel. The second transport was Teiyo Maru, which experienced an identical sequence of events. B-25 strafers hammered it with machine gun fire. The deck became a killing field. Bombs struck and the ship began sinking.
The engagement lasted 15 minutes, from 10:35 a.m. when the first strafer attacked to 10:50 a.m. when the final transport sustained damage. During those 15 minutes, the B-25 strafers sank or damaged all 8 transports and 4 destroyers. Approximately 2,700 to 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors died. Most deaths resulted from drowning when ships sank. Others died from machine gun fire before their ships went down. Survivors spent extended periods in the water. Some reached lifeboats. Some were recovered by the 4 surviving destroyers. Most drowned. This represented the most devastating air attack against a naval convoy in Pacific War history. The Japanese designated it the disaster at the Bismarck Sea. They lost an entire reinforcement convoy, thousands of troops, and critical supplies. The planned offensive at Leh never occurred. Japan never recovered from this loss, and never attempted another major convoy through those waters. General Kenny classified it as a decisive victory. 12 modified bombers had eliminated a convoy that could have altered the entire course of the New Guinea campaign. Guns' unauthorized modifications had saved thousands of Allied lives. Official recognition and expansion. Following the battle, General Kenny sent a message to General Hap Arnold, the General Commanding General of the Army Air Forces. He described the modified B-25 strafers, explained their operational effectiveness, and requested formal approval for the modifications. General Arnold's response arrived 3 days later. He approved all modifications, ordered expedited production, and requested technical data be sent to all theaters of operation. Suddenly, Gunn's unauthorized modifications became official military doctrine. Lockheed and North American Aviation studied Gunn's designs and incorporated his modifications into factory production procedures. By June 1943, B-25s were being manufactured at assembly lines in California with 8 forward-firing nose guns as standard equipment.
The B-25G model, introduced in August 1943, included a 75mm cannon in the nose, in addition to the machine guns, representing Gunn's concept taken even further. By the end of the war, over 3,000 B-25 strafers had been produced. They served in every theater of operations: Europe, Pacific, China, Burma, and India. Wherever the B-25 operated, Gunn's modifications saved lives and eliminated enemy forces. Continued innovation. Gunn never ceased modifying aircraft. Following the Bismarck Sea victory, he focused on other aircraft types. He modified A-20 attack bombers with forward-firing guns, modified P-38 fighters with additional wing-mounted guns, and modified C-47 transports into gunships for night operations. Every modification violated regulations. Every modification functioned effectively. His superiors learned to ignore his activities. Approving Gunn's modifications after they proved effective was easier than attempting to stop him beforehand. By late 1944, hundreds of aircraft in the Pacific Theater had Gunn modifications. Pilots specifically requested them. Maintenance crews learned his techniques. His innovations spread throughout the entire 5th Air Force. Gunn's death. On October 11, 1944, Gunn was flying a B-25 strafer on a reconnaissance mission over the Philippines. He was 48 years old. He had spent 3 years modifying aircraft, flying combat missions, and engaging Japanese forces. His aircraft was intercepted by Japanese fighters, 4 A6mm Zeros. Gunn's B-25 had 14 forward-firing guns. He engaged the Zeros, shot one down, and damaged another. However, the remaining 2 aircraft positioned themselves on his tail. They shot his aircraft apart and killed his crew. The B-25 crashed into the jungle outside Clark Field. Gunn died in the crash. His body was recovered 3 weeks later by advancing American forces. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously. The citation mentioned his modifications to B-25 bombers, his innovations in attack tactics, and his contribution to the victory at the Bismarck Sea. However, the citation did not capture what Gunn actually represented. He was not a hero in the traditional sense. He was a mechanic consumed by grief and rage. He was a father who had lost his family and spent 3 years fighting the people who had taken them from him. He saved thousands of American lives not through noble sacrifice, but through brutal innovation. He built weapons designed to kill efficiently. He modified aircraft to maximize destruction. Every modification, every gun he installed, and every attack tactic he developed was motivated by grief, fury, and the absolute refusal to allow anyone else's family to die the way his had. This is what actually occurred. A mechanic's family perished. He modified some bombers. Those bombers killed 3,000 enemy soldiers in 15 minutes. The approach was simple, brutal, and effective. This represents how innovation functions in warfare, not through committees, engineering studies, or approved procedures, but through individuals who have lost,